Good afternoon and welcome to CISO Forum Canada 2021. It is truly my honor to be hosting this session, which is going to focus on DDoS attacks and certain trends that are happening in that particular realm of discussion. It's my honor to also be continuing these sessions through the afternoon, and I believe this is the fourth or the fifth session, and there's been some riveting discussions online, and I'm looking forward to enjoying in that, partaking in that, and bringing some further perspective into this session. My name is Abbas Hirji, and as you know, I lead both cybersecurity and AI practices at Durham College. And for this session, we're going to be focusing on a topic that perhaps you've heard quite a bit about. If my memory serves me right, we go back to 1996 when we're talking about DDoS attacks. You're talking about a time when a Yellow Pages-like book was published about the various websites that you could access through the World Wide Web. On a humorous note, you're talking about a time when I was simply busy trying to figure out how to look cool with a Walkman the size of a lunchbox. DDoS attacks are that old, but they've evolved over a period of time. Prior to this session, some of my guests were talking about the concept of layer 7 attacks, the concept of virtual armies that now exist, attacks that can be volumized in different ways, but attacks that can also focus on very specific layers of the applications. Attacks that can be triggered from multiple environments thanks to botnets. So for this session, sponsored by Cloudflare, a trusted name in mitigating against these attacks, we're going to dive deep into this topic, and we're going to uncover some trends, some patterns, as well as some best practices. I want to thank the team at Cloudflare for making this session happen. For those of you who are aware, on the Cyber Exchange platform, you can join the Cloudflare group and get a lot of interesting pieces of information. Cloudflare has, if you look at some of the reports that are there as well, you're going back to some of the largest DDoS attacks that they've mitigated going back to 2014. In fact, most recently, an attack that was probably scaling about 17 million requests per second was thwarted by our friends at Cloudflare. Numerous attacks in the recent past, lots of data available on their group, and I'll be picking from some of that to discuss today's concept. So welcome to this discussion, and let's dive deep into it. And without further ado, I'm going to begin by welcoming my panelists. I'm going to start off first with Kalyan Chakravarthy, somebody who's been a mentor to me, somebody who works in the region of Durham, is in fact their CIO, and more importantly, someone who constantly reminds us that creativity is about thinking about new things, innovation is about doing it. And I want to see and learn from him about some innovative perspectives around DDoS. Kalyan, it's always a pleasure to have you. Please introduce yourself, tell the audience a little bit about what you do, and why is this topic of particular importance to you? Kalyan?
Thanks, Ali. I would have let you talk a few more minutes on me, then I didn't have to introduce myself because I would never do justice to myself on that. So my name is Kalyan Chakravarthy, but I go by KC. I'm the CIO and the Chief Transformation Officer for the region of Durham. And it's been a wonderful 3 or 4 years for the region because Durham region is one of the fastest growing region in Canada, as well as we are investing heavily on technology to really for our residents as well as for our employees.
Absolutely, and I really want to tap into this because there's an element when it comes to DDoS where yes, you have to understand the enterprise architecture, but there's the element when it comes to engagement with the public and getting the public to understand what things can contribute to these attacks. And there have been some very interesting initiatives in our region with regards to public awareness. And we're going to bring that up as we go through, especially when we talk about the shifting patterns in DDoS, especially with insider attacks. So Casey, I'm looking forward to that. And as always, thank you so much for taking the time and joining me today. I'm now going to go to Ragulan, someone who's on the CISO Forum Canada board with myself. This is my first engagement with you, Ragulan. And to the people that I've spoken to in looking up a little bit about your work, I've heard a common trend with a lot of people that say, he's a good person that brings out the good in other people. And a lot of folks have spoken very highly about how you've engaged them, especially with new trends in cyber. So Ragulan, welcome to CISO Forum Canada, your first experience with us here. Ragulan, tell our audience a little bit about what you do, the position that you currently hold, and from your perspective, why is this discussion on DDoS with Cloudflare particularly important? Ragulan?
Yeah, thank you, Ali, and CyberX team for having me on the panel. Really excited to be here in an important topic such as DDoS. I'm currently the Vice President of IT Shared Services and Head of Cybersecurity at Sobeys. And Sobeys is one of only two national grocery retailers in Canada. So I have a pretty exciting job keeping Sobeys secure and running the whole cybersecurity program. This is really a timely topic for me because, as all of you know, DDoS has always been a concern, a risk for most of the enterprises. But I see there are two trends that are currently, I would say, undergoing that makes this problem much bigger and a higher risk for us. And the first one being just the expedited digital transformation. As all of you know, with COVID, pretty much every industry is becoming a technology company, and there's lots of transformation going on, which is really putting a lot of the digital properties and services in internet facing, creating a much larger attack surface for DDoS. And the second thing is really proliferation of IoT devices, and it's not just millions, it's billions of them, right? And it really is ripe for DDoS type attacks using a botnet army. So pretty timely in there.
Absolutely, Ragulan, and I would agree with you that not only are we looking at various industries that have gone through digital transformation, there are the technology questions, but there are also the process and the people questions when it comes to understanding DDoS and how to mitigate against it. So I'm looking forward to that. And Ragulan, I know in the prep to this session, I mentioned that if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You can't use some of the same tools. You've got to start thinking outside of the box, or better yet, burn that box. I'm really excited to also see where your journey goes with Cloudflare. And thank you, Ragulan. Very excited to spend the next 55 minutes with you. Trey, before I ask you to introduce yourself, let me, on a personal note, also mention that myself at Durham College, for most of the work that we do, we rely heavily on Cloudflare services. I think for our audience as well, it's super important to realize if you just go to the Cloudflare website and you look at the various initiatives through which they've given back to different movements as well, to different opportunities online, creating a very different kind of a secure environment online for not just large enterprise, but for small to medium enterprise as well. So I do want to thank the Cloudflare team for consistently giving back and allowing and facilitating these discussions. Trey, you're a person who's got a wealth of information when it comes to this topic. I'd like you to introduce yourself. Of course, I want to welcome you. Please introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about what you do and why is this subject, it's at the core of Cloudflare's operations, but you're consistently researching it. Tell us, why does this subject intrigue you so much? Trey?
Well, thank you so much for the kind words. As you mentioned, Cloudflare's mission is to help build a better internet. We feel this sort of very strongly because so much of the world now depends on the internet for so many people just to get on with their daily lives, to do business, but also to connect with loved ones, etc. And no time has that been more real than the last 2 years as we've all worked from home and dealt with the impacts of a global pandemic. And I can sort of thank our lucky stars that this pandemic happened now and not 10 years ago, before we all had broadband and video links and wonderful products like Zoom and others. So my name is Trey Guinn. I work as a field technologist reporting to our CTO. I've been at Cloudflare for about 8.5 years, and so I've seen the company grow and seen our focus on DDoS, and to sort of highlight the reason why DDoS is so core to what we work on, and one of the key services that we offer is right back to that point about trying to make the internet better. And make the internet better for everyone. DDoS is so disruptive. It has the ability to impact not only large enterprise, small enterprise, but also nonprofits and individuals just trying to get about their daily lives. And so our ability, our hope to help make the internet better is what drives us in that direction. And we're in a fortunate position to be in front of a lot of internet traffic, and therefore we can stop a lot of DDoS, and we are happy to share what we have learned so other folks can take that and sort of drive our mission as well to help make the internet better.
Yeah, if there was ever an emblem for lessons from the edge, it's definitely Cloudflare, and there's a lot that you folks can talk about when it comes to edge computing and DDoS. So looking forward to this, Trey. And I actually saw a note that came into me, direct message, which said that, hey, would also like to discuss a little bit, if possible, and there's time, discuss a little bit about visibility into operations and how do you proactively plan or notice what to do when you are noticing some activity that could be reflective of a DDoS attack. So we'll get to those questions to our audience. Thank you so much for tuning in. To our audience members, look, I often, once in a while, if I find it, I try to use my brains, but otherwise, I borrow the ones around me. And these are some of the best minds that I could think of on this subject. So we're going to dive deep into this discussion right away. Casey, it wouldn't be a session with me if I didn't start off with you. So you're on the hot seat to begin with. Casey, a very direct question. And this is more to do with DDoS is a very relevant reality that we're facing consistently. Especially you work in the field of AI, you lecture in that field as well. You know, with the emergence of different botnets or the recent Cloudflare report that we've read, botnets that have formed virtual armies to go after various assets on the World Wide Web. How do you prepare your security team from looking at DDoS less as we have a DDoS incident to respond to, versus this is part of our day-to-day affairs and having a playbook to deal with DDoS? How do you change that mindset, Casey?
I think it is about, like, it starts with that incident response. It is about that incident response for sure, like people knowing what needs to be done when it happens. Because that's a very, very important thing to first you're identifying it, and then you have the roles and responsibilities of the people that they know exactly what needs to be done. The second is about, like, it is having that business continuity and the disaster recovery, going with the IR piece of it, where whether you're talking about having multiple ISP providers like to have it, or like to really look at it and say, hey, once this happens, how do I look at what are my public facing things, and like what can be going down for how much time, like if there is something happening. So it is about, as much as it sounds like a cliched response of having that IR, it is about the combination of the incident response, business continuity, and the disaster recovery. And more than anything, in my opinion, in the practical terms, because I think all of us have been gone through at least one of those for sure. So it is about having those roles and responsibility, and like having that, keeping your calm at that point of time. This is part and parcel of it. As you have said, Ali, that like this existed when you're trying to be cool, taking your lunchbox. You're still trying to look cool now, and like you'll still be
I
cool.
ate my
like,
lunch
20 minutes
already.
later.
I'm already hungry.
Yeah. So it will still be there. So this is the part and parcel of it. It is going to happen. The technology might evolve, the methodology might change, but the concept is definitely the same. So how are you managing it, like from the latest and greatest of technology? And from a people perspective, knowing their roles in this is very important. And this is where I say that, like, where if you're running an organization, it's all about your employees and your partners, because there is an ecosystem that you are creating to say some things you might not be doing in-house, some things you'll have your partners done. So how are you making sure that like all of you are on the same page and you are available, and like everybody knows what their responsibility is when it is happening?
Casey, I really want to commend you for this, because you've always been a proponent of the fact that no person's an island when it comes to security, and I really like the fact that you're not using the word vendor, you're going partner, and that's how it's been very successful for us with our work at Durham College, where we use a lot of Cloudflare services. We've looked at partnering with them, and I do want to give a shout out, Trey, to your team member Ash, who's been very instrumental in some of our engagements. So thank you, Casey, for setting that. Ragulan, I want to come to you, and then Trey will put you on the hot seat. Yeah. Ragulan, Casey said something really interesting. When I think through it, often we say that's the way we always did things, and that's really not the way you want to do things. You want to think differently. Ragulan, you from a DDoS perspective, looking at how much from a Sobeys and your applications and how people are shopping online, your delivery services, so on and so forth, digital transformation, for lack of a better word, on steroids. Now, you've started to rethink DDoS, and from an incident response perspective, you're thinking about keeping DDoS top of your priority and have it part of business as usual, that we've got a DDoS strategy in place and what to do. Can you tell me a little bit about how you're rethinking DDoS for your team? And why was, immediately when I said Cloudflare, you said, let's discuss this. Why was that so important to you, Ragulan?
Yeah, so I would say it's just not just Sobeys, but most of the enterprises, if you look at the approach we have taken when it comes to DDoS, has evolved quite a bit over the last 5 years or so. Back in the days, it was really a one-off special event when someone get DDoS attacked, right? But if you look at now how things have evolved, in some ways, you're getting DDoS around the clock. I'm not talking about terabits per second type attacks, which are becoming also unfortunately fairly common nowadays. But I'm talking about those slow and low type attacks. That's probing attacks that's happening around the clock. So in terms of how we have evolved our approach to dealing with DDoS, I mean, as Casey mentioned, having incident response playbook, having the right roles and responsibility, everybody trained is very important. But what's becoming a must-have, almost equal important, is more automation-based detection, like AI-based detection, ML-based detection, because on the human side, there's only so much you can do because these things are evolving in real time, really, right? If you think about it, it's like the attack today is different than the attack tomorrow, and so on. So having a program where you're automatically detecting and tuning and putting blockers in is very critical. On top of your standard incident response based approaches that we have always had in our arsenal.
Absolutely, and I think what you're basically saying, what gets measured gets done. And with tools like Cloudflare, you're able to measure what is your proactive response, right? You're able to look at how effective it is, and you're able to enhance from there, I think, and making decisions not just based on data, but context that you can get from a Cloudflare-like environment. So thank you, Ragulan, for setting that as well. And Trey, I think this is a perfect sort of entryway to bring you into the discussion. And I want to keep the discussion again to this incident response and thinking about responding to DDoS less reactive and more proactive. Trey, can you tell us some lessons from the field in terms of how you've helped some teams take that proactive response to DDoS and not look at it as this one-off, it's a major incident, let's just respond to it? How do you make it into a proactive engagement and an opportunity for learning and growth within the different environments where you're implementing your stack? Trey?
Yeah, as we've seen DDoS proliferation, as you said, this is a 20-year-old problem, but it just continues to become more and more prevalent. And it's more and more prevalent because the attackers can impact businesses and impact individuals more easily. As more things are dependent on the internet, it's easier and easier to create volumetric attacks or to harness botnets. And so it's just sort of a growing problem. I would sort of tag on to what KC said, which is incident response and having well-established teams and well-established processes is critical, but also what Ragulan said, which is, DDoS attacks are everyday experiences now. And so what we're seeing across our customers is this shift from DDoS attack that used to be, a pager going off and someone being woken up in the middle of the night to you get a report at the end of the week that said, we stopped 600 DDoS attacks this week. And so what we see in the market is really, and I think that where the industry is going is taking something that would have been a page, 2 years ago is now business as usual and something that doesn't change, doesn't wake anyone up. But there's going to be a threshold where pagers need to go off. And so it's as the threat has grown, we sort of have to reevaluate where is the business as usual and where does the incident response process kick in. Of course, at Cloudflare, we're sort of tip of the spear, so we're seeing literally thousands of DDoSes a day and stopping them, and we see the worst ones. And so our thresholds are very, very high. But I think what we're seeing, if we're moving that direction, we think the industry is sort of coming with us. And we want to get to the point where DDoS is just, it's always business as usual, and there should be no threshold by which it has to set off a pager. But that's where we're aiming at. That's our sort of ambitious goal.
Absolutely, and I think one of the key thing that you mentioned at the end, that ambitious goal, and really that, and I thank you for even setting that context around incident response and business as usual, and having teams proactively prepared by also looking at data, looking at metrics, and reading those reports to understand what constitutes or what are some of those signs that you may be experiencing an attack of some sorts, and setting those thresholds on how to act. However, I'm going to bring the conversation to Ragulan, Casey, and then Trey back to you, because I think Trey brought up a very interesting point, is that while we might be moving towards thinking about DDoS more frequently, thinking about it as day-to-day, how do we need to act, how do we need to respond, Raghu, the question that I have for you is that there was this traditional thinking that DDoS, or the source of DDoS, tends to be outside of the enterprise, Meanwhile, as you mentioned in your introduction, when you look at the proliferation of IoT devices and devices that technically could, again, fall victim to different campaigns and realize or be a part of an attack triggered by a bot, there's also the insider element when it comes to discussing DDoS. From your perspective, if I may ask you a very direct question, what are some of the challenges when you think about insider threats and DDoS attacks? What are some of the things that you've been thinking about?
Yeah, a great question, Ali. When we think about insider threat from a DDoS perspective, I see two different categories. The first one is really devices that are in your network that are being hijacked to use as attack vehicle for DDoS. In other words, join the bot army as we call it, right? So it's not really humans, but really your corporate assets that are being hijacked. Everybody has cameras, we have all sort of temperature sensors and so on and so on. These are all pretty vulnerable for this type of hijacking. That's one thing. That, of course, technology will help. The second thing is, if you look at sort of the human aspect of it, this doesn't really become a big problem for enterprises, but you just have to look at what happens in the education community. It's widely known that students who are disgruntled, they pay $30 on the internet or dark web, they hire some DDoS a bot, they pay some money and they attack their own schools, right? So the cost of initiating a DDoS attack is so low. If someone is motivated and they have some sort of a agenda or they want to prove something, it's pretty easy to do, right? So if you try to translate that to enterprises, we have to be cognizant of potential threat as such, although I wouldn't say it's a big problem now, but it's something obviously any of us in InfoSec have to be cognizant of and think about putting proactive measures against it.
I just want to work with that a little bit, Ragulan, and thank you for that. I think that, you've set a very interesting trend of conversation, which I might pick up a little bit later on, which is the motivations for some of these DDoS attacks. And I think later on we'll come to that, so thank you for that. But Casey, just picking off what Ragulan just said, he's talking about, he's talked about the digital transformation facing Sobeys or some of the things happening within education. If we take the same thing and translate it in the public sector, the region that we work in, we often have looked at the CISOs as, the guys who put the no in innovation. But you haven't been that individual. You've allowed for innovative products. Just recently, for example, the WAVE, which is the automated transportation system, part of the DRT transit in Whitby, you facilitated a lot of different innovation-based projects, which has resulted in more devices entering into the enterprise. My own teams have done work with your teams as well. You've looked at DDoS attacks and also looked at it from a policy perspective. You started to look at implementing some new policies within the enterprise. You started to have this conversation about DDoS with more than just the security folks. Can you tell us a little bit about how you're rethinking DDoS and how you're not just looking outside the enterprise, but also inside, Casey?
I think there are always two pieces of security, right? Like one is the prevention, the other is the remedy. So I think that focus needs to be there. And especially with the new digital transformation, where our office sites have moved from 70 to 5,000. So there are that many remote locations. And the IoT devices, if I combine the traffic and transit and water, I don't even think that my math goes into how many devices that are there in terms of it. And one thing where I want to add on, where we are also thinking about is where Ragulan, from the insider perspective, it might be the device, but it might have been a compromised device, where a credential compromise. That is one more thing that we are very much worried about as well. So that's where what we are looking at is what do we want to do from an awareness perspective? That is the biggest thing to really look at it from an awareness perspective. That's the first thing that we are rolling out on from a great knowledge for our employees, because they don't know. The digital literacy of your employees is it's a rainbow of things, right? It is that gamut, from 0 to 100 part of it. So you need to really push them onto one side. The second part of it is about its network segregation. From our thing, it is how much ever we want to segregate, because the remedy part of it, we want to reduce the amount of things. Like if anything happens, we want to contain it, like quarantine it at a certain place. So that is where, when we talk about these devices which are vulnerable to this, like relatively speaking, we want to really segregate them and put it out. And the third and the last one where I really look at it is like where, when you have this is that risk, that is that inherent risk that you are carrying. And like you need to have that kind of skill set that is developed in your team or your extended team to really face the things when things happen. And then how quickly then can you get up, and most importantly, looking at the kind of data that like making sure that like we are not losing any one of that.
Fantastic. And I think, I really like the fact that you've also brought in the discussion around risk. And, when we were planning for this session, one of the things that you said, which stuck with me was, we've been asked, can we completely eliminate the risk of a DDoS attack? And can you make sure that we never face one of these? And you responded by simply saying, look, we'll never eliminate it, but we will manage it and we will mitigate the risk in certain ways. And I appreciate that. Kalyan, you were going to add something?
Yeah, like if you would be surprised by the kind of questions that I get, like I think at least daily once, where I get asked, are we cyber secure? So we don't have DDoS attacks, right? Like we spend X amount of dollars, so we won't have DDoS attacks. So that is the kind of awareness, like, and that brings in like where people think that like it is, you put in something, a tool or a solution, and it works, and like everything will be solved. It's not a problem to be solved. It is an inherent that is going to be there. It's a continuous journey. It is not like, oh yes, it is there, on or off kind of a thing. That kind of knowledge, that kind of awareness is what like we need to do from our side.
Are we cyber secure? The existential angst of security leaders is the title of Kalyan's next book. I have nominated you, Kalyan, to do it, and we'll be waiting for that release, Kalyan.
You will be the first one to buy it.
All right, I will try my best to read. Casey, always thank you for that perspective. And I really also like, again, people, process, technology, and you focus on the people side. Trey, one or two questions have come in direct message to me, so I'll stitch them into this and put you into the hot seat. You heard multiple perspectives. And I think Ragulan and Casey do agree with you that it's not just about looking at what's external to the enterprise, but what's internal as well. However, can you help our audience understand that, especially leaders in this space, when it comes to DDoS attacks, you're not just looking at it from a singular perspective, which is a whole barrage of devices that have now sent a request to your server. It can be, for example, at the application level. I spoke about layer 7 attacks. It could be attacks that are orchestrated or trying to just hit the TCP handshake that's happening. When you think about the different types of DDoS attacks that are out there, multiple, 26 plus types of attacks that are out there, how do you help organizations understand that landscape, and how do you help them prioritize what they need to be prepared for? Trey?
So you or Casey raised a great point about how organizations have gone from tens of sites to tens of thousands of sites as everyone has gone remote. We've seen that if you really think about computer networking is about a step, connecting users to applications. And now our users are no longer concentrated in individual locations. And you could say that our users also include IoT devices and machines and, business to business APIs. So there's this massive distribution happening on the user side and a variety of technology that's being used. In addition to that, we're seeing actually the same distribution on the application side. So cloud transformations and cloud adoption has just really led a lot of enterprises from going from running applications in their own data center to now running applications in more data centers, because no one ever finishes their cloud migration. They just adopt some more data centers. And then once they consume some SaaS providers, your data, your applications are running in tens or hundreds of locations now, and your users are in thousands of locations. So I'm getting to an answer here. We're now in this world where your infrastructure, the enterprise landscape, is so distributed that the delta, or maybe the difference between an internal threat and an external threat, doesn't look that different. Really, what you think about is you have a highly, the sort of future we're all moving towards is this highly sort of distributed computing environment, and the network is the only thing that can provide the sort of control layer and security layer for these attacks. And so when we talk about the kinds of attacks that we have to deal with, you still have the standard sort of schema, essentially, or taxonomy to understand these attacks. You have network-based attacks, and then you sort of application-based attacks. They can come from the inside or the outside. Network-based attacks tend to be dumb attacks, or I should say more like cavemen with a club trying to sort of overwhelm network links. Application attacks can be more sophisticated. DDoS, of course, is normally trying to exhaust resources. Casey, I think, sort of hit on the point also when you start thinking about, which is also very critical, starting about credential compromise and sort of data exfiltration. That may not be high volume. They might be trying to exhaust resources at that time, but you can have a data exfiltration attack or a credential compromise happening at the same time as a DDoS. So oftentimes DDoSs will be used as sort of air cover, so you don't see a slow and low attack that are, there's 10 really bad requests that came in the 10 million in the last hour. And how do you find those and treat them differently? So those are the types of attacks that we're seeing. And we think that because of the sort of distributed future that of computing that we're living in, the internet is really becoming the sort of the network that eats up all of the other networks. The internet, in a way, is sort of eating the corporate network. And so when you think about the kinds of attacks you need to mitigate from, whether it's internal threat or external threat, those are really just sort of the same attacks we're seeing across the internet today. And as that progresses, and it will continue to follow, I think, a similar taxonomy from network as well as application based.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Trey. And Trey, again, you've resonated that same point, right? Which is around the multiple applications that are now within the enterprise, IoT, Internet of Things, also known as Internet of Threats. But I think, again, you focused on the people element. And what I really enjoyed in that example that you said about those 10 requests in the 10 million is the data is there, but you don't just dump data, you dump context. And one of the things, and I'll say this for especially for a lot of the CISOs that are listening, that's motivated my team into recommending Cloudflare options and looking at Cloudflare more from a DDoS perspective, is about the amount of visibility you get into that data, what's been happening, how that data is annotated, so on and so forth. It really helps with your own internal analysis as well. So thank you, Trey, for setting that perspective. Trey, you look like you want to add something else.
Yeah, I was just going to say one other thing. We talk about internal and external threats. The other thing we have to remember is a sort of operational threat. With internal threats, you have the potential of a compromised device, a compromised user account. You could potentially also have a malicious employee that they know where the soft spots are, where you could cause an impact. Or actually, I think Ragulan actually hit a good point with a student that doesn't want to take a test today. It's so easy to go hire a DDoS service and knock that testing service offline. But what we also seen across lots of customers, and this is just the nature of humans, is the number of inadvertent DDoS attacks where an enterprise has attacked themselves. When you misconfigure your Internet of Things devices or release a updated mobile app that is sort of has a polling interval that's at 1 second instead of 100 or at 1,000 seconds, you can see these massive sort of impacts on your own infrastructure. And so as we live in this sort of distributed world, it's important to have the controls in place to be able to live with some of the inadvertent sort of self-inflicted attacks as well.
Absolutely. And I think this is where the ROI of investing in the right solution really comes to play. So I know we've got about 15 odd minutes left, and I want to go back. We'll go Ragulan, Casey, and then we'll come to Trey to summate the areas of conversation. Ragulan, let's come to you. And again, this is a question. And again, to folks who are DMing me questions, you can DM me or you can drop it in the live chat. If I don't get to it, somebody from the Cloudflare team, and I'm sure Casey and Ragulan will be happy to engage with you later on to address your questions. But keep them coming. Direct message them if you feel comfortable to as well. Ragulan, this is a question more around, and in line with the script that we had discussed, is around how do you mitigate, not necessarily even mitigate, how do you respond in the event that you are hit with a DDoS attack and some of your applications, some of your services have come down. What are some best practices that you've reflected on, let's say one or two of them, in order to bring your services back to par normal? Ragulan?
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I just want to quickly comment on
Absolutely.
a really good point Trey made earlier. often DDoS is used as a distraction or deflection from a slightly different type of attack that's underway, let's say data exfiltration and so on. So it's very important. I'm not saying it's always the case, but it's more often than it's not. So it's very important in the incident response playbook. You don't, if there's let's say DDoS attack, you don't put all the eggs in one basket per se. You don't get the whole SecOps team chasing after the DDoS. You do want, subset of the team to be looking at other vectors that may be, underway as well, right? It's a really, really important point that all of us in security need to keep in mind. Now going back to your question, Ali, in terms of, if a company is, it's unfortunate enough to be severely attacked, meaning, as we said earlier, everybody is always under some sort of a DDoS attack around the clock. But let's say it's severe enough that it brings down your services. That's where your incident response comes in. That's where your tabletop exercises that you have practiced this, before an event actually happens. That's all important in terms of having the teams set up so that everybody knows what their roles are. And also it's very important you have I would say a multi-tiered approach to capacity and DDoS mitigation. By that I mean you have a plan for network based attack, let's say layer 3 attack, you have a plan for layer 7 application layer attack, you're able to sinkhole the traffic, you're able to transfer the traffic over to, let's say, a higher bandwidth, let's say a provider you have a peering relationship with. So it's very important you have in your planning, look at all the options depending on the size and the intensity of the attack, right? It's one of the things, it's not whether, but it's when. Every organization will go through this. So the more you practice ahead of time, the better.
Absolutely. And I want to work with that, Casey, because Ragulan's outlined a very interesting plan for the type of attack, layer 3, layer 7. You need to have your response plans in place. Kalyan, if I can, and again, weave in a question is, how challenging has it been to get your teams up to speed with new techniques, new strategies, etc., especially as even, forget the enterprise going remote, even your security teams have now had to operate remote given the conditions we've been in. How challenging has it been to bring about new practices and best practices when it comes to DDoS mitigation?
I think it's been very challenging because like the remote teams, it creates a lot of advantages, but like it creates some disadvantages as well, where when you're doing let's say a tabletop exercise, yes, it is great. Like there are a lot of technology that is available. There are a lot of tools. There are a lot of platforms, can't deny that. But still that element of creating that like real life environment is getting difficult, like when we are doing it. And then from an actions perspective, where it became a challenge to really keep all these plans, where I'm saying that like currently all the people in technology are doing two full-time jobs. One is they are dealing with the pandemic. That means they are supporting the organization in their own way to really respond to the pandemic, whatever the organization that is. Every organization is going through it, and every IT person is going through that part of it. The first is the job of responding to the pandemic, and the second is your actual job that you're supposed to do, and like that is where it is. And then when you are doing the second kind of a thing in a remote one, the priority of it comes from whatever is coming in front of you. So that's where the change, that remote working has really made it difficult. But coming back to the response part of it, like what I believe in, to add to what Ragulan has said, is about communication. I think in all these plans, we do underplay the role of communication. And when we talk about communication, I talk about communication in two senses. One is about the technical communication. That is like where we talk about what type of attack it is. That is with your partners, with your team. And the second is the non-technical communication, because majority of your owners, majority of your stakeholders do not understand what a layer 7 is, layer 4 is, what is a DDoS even. So it really doesn't matter. So for them to really get that. And I have seen a lot of playbooks where there is not enough emphasis on the actual executive or other stakeholder communication, which is very important in these kind of times. And like never ever the IT team, whoever that is there, should feel that like it is their fault. The first thing where it is everybody when it happens, and Ragulan, I agree with you, it's not about if, it is about when in all these things. But like when this happens, it's not a reflection of your team's performance or something as wrong done by the IT team that this happened. This is an incident that is going to happen irrespective of however well prepared that you are. So the first thing is like it needs to be, we need to move away from that defensive communication to an explaining communication to say, this is what is happening. This is how the things are, and it is what it is. So how are we going back and telling them a plan of action from now to the next 2 hours, 4 hours, 40 hours, don't know, depends upon the situation. So explaining that reduces the stress, pressure, as well as the constant way of dealing with, you're already dealing with a big issue, and you don't want to be dealing with like where you're trying to tell what happened, you could have done 50 other things, what it is there. So removing and like isolating the things to say, what is the root cause for the incident and like whose fault it is, why it has happened, that is for a second one. Now it is about like, how can we contain it? How can we make sure we are back, and how we are communicating to our stakeholders, whether it is the executives or even to the public, to really go out and say, hey, this is what like we are going to be. And everybody is understanding nowadays. If you tell them in a simplistic language that they can understand, people are understanding, because that has become a part and parcel of our life. So that's why I say, like, as much as it is about the playbook, as much as it is about the things, it's more about having that communication being perfected, and like there needs to be a champion to really lead that communication.
Very well said. And I think one of the things once we spoke about is one of the illusions of communication is we think it's happened, but it actually hasn't. You have to practice it. And, both Ragulan and yourself mentioned, these tabletop exercises that then begin to bring these things out to the fore. And just for our audience, I will say this just as a teaser. I think towards the end of CISO Forum Canada, there will be a live tabletop, which is a virtual digitized tabletop that will be played. And really, when I've played those as well, the communications element becomes 99% of the response. So, Casey, thank you for that very eloquent and detailed explanation, staying in line with the people, process, technology approach towards understanding DDoS. So thank you for that, Casey. Gentlemen, we have about 15 minutes left and quite a few questions that have come in. I'm going to try and field these appropriately, but if I miss the mark, please feel free to pass over that question or perhaps rephrase it in whatever way you want. Trey, I'll bring you to the fore, and this is a very direct question, and it has to do with the nature of how victims are chosen, if you can say that from a DDoS perspective. Is it a very, what do you see in the landscape right now? Are you seeing very targeted attacks, or are you seeing spray and pray and see what works? What are you seeing in terms of how bad actors are choosing in terms of their victims or intended victims for their attacks?
I think the short version is all of the above.
Yep.
So you will see unsophisticated attackers doing spray and pray. You'll see sophisticated attackers researching organizations and doing many sort of probing attacks, seeing what they can cause impact to. One thing we've seen is, if 5 years ago the common DDoS vector was just knock someone's website off and cause brand impact, now an attacker, a more sophisticated attacker, will look to see, they'll do a research into which the ASN and IP ranges are owned by an organization, and really start to probe where in which data centers are those IP ranges held, which services are on those ranges, what are the routers that are in common across the IPs, and if they can identify the applications that are hosted in those different ranges, they can correlate that with business process. And so if you know that you are a school and communicating with students is a critical business process, then you know where to focus your attack. If you're a bank and you're doing transactions, or even online banking system, or if you're a food delivery site and you have an API. So as the more sophisticated attackers will go across. At the same time, there are plenty of attackers that are doing sort of ransom-based attacks. So probing sending sort of a test attack, then asking for some Bitcoin. And I would say last year, the Lazarus group was doing lots of ransom-based attacks. And then we saw tons of emails going to customers from attackers where they clearly weren't planning to actually launch an attack at all. They were sending ransom notes where the Bitcoin wallet that you were going to be paid in was the same wallet to every single person they sent the email to. So they weren't even tracking who paid and who didn't. They were just, maybe enough of these folks will reply. And so you really have the full gamut of sort of empty threats to highly sophisticated attackers. I think the one thing you have to deal with is DDoS sadly is sort of here to stay, and it is a threat that you have to deal with. And you're going to have a wide range of sophisticated to unsophisticated attackers.
Trey, I really like the way how you took a very complicated concept and broke it down into simple terms. And sometimes even the simple things are very complicated. So thank you for dissecting that. And I will say this to our audience, that if you go to the Cloudflare group on the platform, you'll see a lot of information that's been dropped there. There are a couple of really interesting videos from a zero trust perspective, but also specific to DDoS. One that really stood out to me, Trey, although very simple and short, was around what questions to ask your DDoS protection provider as well. And I want to come to that question towards the end. So Trey, thank you for that. And you will be on the hot seat for one more question. So you're not quite off the hook, but you're doing a great job so far. So good job, Trey. Ragulan, I want to bring you back into the conversation, and then we'll go to Casey. Casey brought up this thing about communication, right? And when you look at an enterprise like Sobeys or similar like enterprises, I often say this is that often, and being in that world as well, we write software not necessarily for you to work with it, but for software to interface with other software. We've got this mesh of multiple applications that we use. From managing some of your application service providers, how do you engage in communications with them around understanding their practices around DDoS mitigation, given how much you also rely on other softwares that are not necessarily built or written in-house? Raghu?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. As it's pretty obvious nowadays. The application ecosystem is pretty complicated. Back in the days, you had your own on-prem applications, but now you're working with partners. Pretty much every service you offer, there's a handful of partners that are involved in the ecosystem. So the approach we take is clearly have to be different as well. Not unlike many other enterprises out there, when we work with a third party, we do go through a formal third-party risk assessment. And without going into the gory detail, it's a way for us to evaluate whether we are partnering with the enterprise or a partner that has sound cybersecurity and privacy policies and procedures in place. Obviously everything from technical controls to compliance, regulatory. But going back to the theme of communication, even what's their approach to communicating this an incident, right? So we look at both technology and non-technical aspect as well. It's a standard practice, I would say, in the industry. Obviously, the challenge is it's not something you can do it one time and hope that, let's say, a partner passes the check. Doesn't mean a year from now they are still in the same situation, right? So it's something you need to do on an ongoing basis, and finding the right trade-off on how often you want to do this becomes a bit tricky, of course.
Absolutely. And I think that's going to tie into a question that I'm going to ask Trey about interoperability of platforms and how you integrate into different enterprises. So Ragulan, thank you for setting the stage. More cues and clues for your next question, Trey, coming your way. So stay tuned. Casey, I want to bring you into the conversation because this was a question that we had discussed in preparation for this session is, given how complex, both Trey and Ragulan have very eloquently explained this, how complex DDoS attacks have become, different variations in terms of how you respond. How has it been in terms of getting the attention of other executive members within your teams to take responsibility or at least be a part of the planning process in the event that you are in a situation where you're being attacked? For example, how easy has it been to have these conversations with the CFOs, with the CAOs, and get them to the table as well in that planning process? Casey?
I definitely say that it was not easy, but at the same time, I have to admit that I have been lucky to have a CFO who is interested, like where I think the CFA has like the association, whatever the Canadian ones, they are doing some series on cybersecurity. So what that has pushed in is like a lot of people are coming and asking those questions. So our CFO has been very, very supportive, and like she understands like what is there in it. And then like we are even talking about making a cybersecurity as a program rather than just as it's an operational thing, like where we're talking about, it's a set of three things in my opinion. It's about risk, it's about governance, and it's about operations. So how do you combine together? That is where the security comes in, and like where the investment should go in all the quarters, not at this, like, because whatever the decisions that you are making in operations, you are adding some risk onto it, like, and how are you governing that risk part of it. But coming to other executives, like it's always about like making that how Trey has put in, like taking those complex things into making them simpler and having them educated on those, making them aware of it, because it's an ever-changing field. It is what is today is not what is there tomorrow, and we don't even know what's coming on the next 2 days, kind of a thing. So it is a continuous education that we need to be giving it to them. We need to update on this, and especially when some things happen in the market, like you use that as a trigger point to educate them. Like for example, if something happens on the supply chain attack, whatever it is happening, what is a supply chain attack? What are the different types of things? So you use them to really educate it, and you plan it around and make sure that like they understand these terms and terminology and what are the changes that are happening. It's the job of us IT folks to really give them, like if anything is changing from a financial terms, it is the CFO's responsibility. If anything is changing in the IT terminology, it is the CIO or the CISO's responsibility to really educate the rest of the team.
I see another title for a book, The ROI of Cybersecurity. And Casey, that's your second one that I have coined for you. You are welcome. But Casey, jokes apart, what I really enjoyed also in that response was that also in the last 18 months or so, the pace at which we've had to instrument some of those conversations. As Satya says, Nadella is, within 2 months, we've seen 2 years worth of innovation, 2 years worth of digital transformation, and keeping pace with that while also maintaining communications around getting the workforce remote and rendering public services from an IT perspective at that level. So kudos to you. And I don't think you mentioned we IT folks, I don't think people quite understand how fast you had to move and how actively you had to move in that time period. So thank you for everything that you do. We're coming very, very close, but I see you want to say something. So Casey, go for it.
Yeah, now this is for all the IT folks who are watching it. Like there have been the COVID heroes for all the rest of the things. Like I think I definitely want to appreciate all the IT folks that are doing it, because without them, like this remote working would not have been made possible. So these are the one of the COVID heroes. We need to recognize each and every IT person. And I tell this to every time to everybody, saying that like the IT folks are doing two jobs. One, they are they are responding to the pandemic. Two, they are doing their daytime jobs. So please make sure that like you appreciate each and every IT person that you meet, because they are doing two jobs, and like they are one of the pandemic heroes.
Absolutely. And the superstar hero, I would say, are all of you individuals. But Casey, even more so because of your stage presence being very effective as well. And it's always been a pleasure to share the stage with you. But Casey, thank you for that very important message. As we keep talking about post-pandemic, but we're not quite there, especially given how the world is changing with hybrid work. So Casey, thank you for that. Trey, the final question to you, and then we'll come to a soft landing. And this has to do with, I referenced earlier on that there's a very interesting paper in the Cloudflare group around what questions to ask your provider when it comes to DDoS mitigation, et cetera. But from your perspective, when it comes to determining whether the Cloudflare stack works well with a particular enterprise's goals, what are some of those top 2 or 3 things that you look for to ensure that the Cloudflare stack is suitable for a particular organization? How do you ensure interoperability and seamless ease of use? Can you comment on that a little bit, Trey?
Yeah, I think the critical part is, and I obviously biased as I work at Cloudflare, and we're trying to do the right thing. But when you look at DDoS vendors, ideally the interaction happens on a protocol level with standards. And so if your integration occurs over TCP, your integration occurs over BGP, then you have this ability to adopt service sort of inflow of the protocol, and you're not looking at at a proprietary integration. I think that's sort of step one. The other thing, of course, with DDoS is the sort of architectures in which people have applied them historically. So really, we've seen just a transition from doing things with boxes that are sort of on-premise all the way through sort of cloud-based services, and then sort of like a couple steps in the middle. It's clear that because of the scale of the threat and the scale of attacks, whether it's requests per second or the terabits of volume, that cloud-based services are really the only ones effective at stopping DDoSes any longer. And so I think that's one of the big questions I would ask if you're looking at a DDoS vendor is how, not only how large of an attack can you stop, how quickly can you stop one, but sort of the questions around what are the implications to performance of turning on the DDoS service? Are you going to be tromboning my traffic through some weird part of the world that the traffic would not normally have flown through? And two, do you have to do anything to scale up or scale down? Because I think true SaaS and true cloud should be ubiquitous, and it should feel to a consumer as it's an infinitely scalable. And so those are the things I would actually focus on. Make sure that it's integrated through protocol, so you're not trying to do sort of any sort of proprietary integrations. Secondly, that your traffic is able to, that the DDoS vendor sort of sits in path wherever your traffic is going to be anyways. And third, that there's no sort of scaling up or scaling down that you would have to deal with. And those are three things I would look at when picking a DDoS vendor.
He's a charm. Thank you, Trey, for again responding not just eloquently, but in a very concise fashion as well. Gentlemen, we've come to the end of our time together, but once again, not just on behalf of myself as a moderator, I've learned and benefited so much from your perspectives. I also know that we're going into the holiday season. It's a crucial time for all of you, but you've taken the time to be here, and that means quite a lot to me and to the audience as well. To the audience that's watching, I'll repeat this. Please go onto the Cloudflare group and retrieve some of those assets, chat with some of the folks from Cloudflare. And more importantly, I know I may not have gotten to all of your questions. You can leave your questions there, and someone from the Cloudflare team or our panelists will definitely engage with you in the coming future. To our panelists, I'm going to ask you to stay on while I bid our audience adieu and invite them to join the next sessions. So firstly, again, Casey, Ragulan, Trey, thank you for being such champions, and not all heroes wear capes, and you're definitely demonstrating that in the way you discuss this topic today. So thank you, and please stay on while I just thank our audience once again. If there's anything that I can say is that when you begin to peel away at these layers around DDoS, and you look at an organization like Cloudflare, especially when you hear backing from individuals like Casey and Ragulan, you realize that a majority, well, I wouldn't necessarily a majority, but a good chunk of your internet assets today rely on service delivery through the Cloudflare environment. And that video which you'll see on the platform around this is how the internet is and how Cloudflare has had an impact is truly, truly fascinating. I say this very often that with our personal devices, they're not personal to us because they're so close to us. They're personal because we pour so much of ourselves onto the World Wide Web. And the implications of having sound DDoS practices are pretty far-reaching. In some cases, even life and death matters can emerge from that. This is a very serious topic, and I thank our audience, but more importantly, thank our panelists for joining us to discuss and dissect this topic in complete depth. My name is Abbas Hirji, again signing out. Have a wonderful rest of the conference. Stay safe, stay healthy. Cheers.